Our top story this hour, 2.3 million Gazans have been virtually cut off from the rest of the world. Communications in a near total blackout as Israel expands its military operations. Airstrikes in Gaza could be seen from near the border with Israel last night. The Hamas media center reporting heavy nighttime clashes with Israeli forces, including tanks at several places by the border fence. A further ground incursion has been backed by airstrikes from the sea and the air. The Israeli military says it is targeting Hamas and its large networks of tunnels and bunkers underground. Early in the war, Israel had already put hundreds of thousands of troops along the border, but until now, troops had largely been conducting brief nightly ground incursions into Gaza before returning to Israel. Hamas has long been labeled a terror organization by Canada and other nations around the world. The number of hostages still in the hands of Hamas stands at 229, according to Israel, with negotiations continuing for their release. More than 1,400 people were slain in Israel during the original incursion by Hamas into the south of the country on October 7th. The health ministry operated by Hamas in Gaza says 7,700 at last update Palestinians have died. Relatives of those being held captive by Hamas are calling on the Israeli government to meet with them amid fears for the safety of their loved ones as Israel expands its ground operations. The families gathered around a central square in Tel Aviv today and warned Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that there will be escalating their protest if a meeting does not take place. Now, joining us on this with more on the expansion of attacks by Israel into Gaza is former NATO Task Force Commander Major General Denis Thompson. First of all, sir, thank you very much for your time. I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you is because as the force commander of the multinational force and observers, and this I believe was from 2014 to 2017, you had a relatively ringside seat for the last time that Israeli forces entered in kind into Gaza. This war is now deadlier than the last four combined between Israel and Hamas. What do you see as different in Israel's offensive this time?
The big difference, good morning, by the way, Andrew, but the big difference is that this time Israel's stated aim is to totally destroy Hamas. The last time in 2014, they were more concerned about the tunnel systems that reached into Israel and in some cases reached into Egypt. And so when they went in, it was not as deep as they planned to go this time. They only went to the fringes of the city and they destroyed about 34 tunnel complexes. And as you quite rightly pointed out, the casualties have now far exceeded what they were in 2014. So similar in a type of operation, but in scope and scale, completely different this time around.
Being 18 kilometers away, just on the Egyptian side of the border from Gaza, what was your impression of what they live under, having Hamas be essentially in charge, unfettered since 2007, and having essentially being cut off from the world in so many ways? What did it seem like inside the territory?
Well, the big issue for them, of course, is resupply. And what I often tell people is that there is a gate that was very close to one of our observation posts. If you can even find them on Google Maps if you're curious, but very close to the Rafah crossing and very close to the Kerem Shalom crossing, both in the south part of Gaza, are two MFO remote sites or observation posts. And so those soldiers were right up, pressed up against the fence. But I think what's most interesting is since my time there, Egypt has completed digging an enormous trench that goes from the Mediterranean all the way down to where the Kerem Shalom crossing is, denying Hamas any access to Egypt via tunnels, because that was a big problem under President Morsi, who was of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, is linked to Hamas and detested by the current regime in Egypt. But the most interesting part about this area is, of course, the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is a commercial crossing that can allow, that is where the bulk of goods go into the Gaza Strip. Over 200 vehicles a day, and would be the obvious choice for a humanitarian corridor, but Israel has denied that to the citizens of Gaza as well. And everything comes through Rafah at a trickle, 10 or a dozen trucks a day, which is clearly not enough to feed a population of that size.
I want to go back in a second to the goals that Israel has right now, but we've been hearing often over the last few days, particularly growing, calls for a humanitarian ceasefire from the United Nations, the Office of Human Rights, about international law that Hamas targeting civilians, taking hostages are war crimes. But also we hear about the obligations that Israel apparently has to not target civilians or engage in what has been called collective punishment. In Gaza, now under essentially a blackout, in a ground offensive or invasion, what are the rules of engagement?
Well, first, let's back up a bit. Israel has the undeniable right to self-defense, and that's what they are leaning on right now. Secondly, Hamas is a legitimate target. But third, as you quite rightly pointed out, collective punishment and unnecessary or avoidable civilian casualties are violations of international humanitarian law and, by extension, the law of armed conflict. So that is where Israel is potentially getting into trouble, because they're losing the war of narratives. The so-called information war is turning against them. And you can see that clearly by the UN General Assembly resolution that was passed, and which Canada abstained to, that as time goes on and as Israel pounds more and more of the Gaza Strip, they will lose the war of narratives, and Hamas will become victims rather than the perpetrators of a horrendous murder which they committed on the 7th of October, and the holder of largely civilian hostages, 75 of whom, or about 75 of whom, are not even, well, they're dual nationals, and they have other countries that are interested in their welfare. So all in all, a war of narratives, if you will, and one that at the moment Israel is not winning, to be perfectly frank.
Well, just thinking about the not the war of words, but the war of weapons right now, there are questions on shifting goalposts and looking at what Israel's goals are, totally wiping out Hamas. How do you discern what that is? What is a Hamas defeat? How can that be measured? And an end game, particularly right now, remains unclear, because Israel says it has no intention to rule the tiny territory, but they're not saying what's going to happen. So what does a victory for Israel or an eradication of Hamas look like?
Well, first of all, that is Israel's stated aim, the complete elimination of Hamas. And it's worth winding back the clock to 2017, when the Iraqi forces, supported by the U.S., cleared Mosul, and it took 9 months to get ISIS out of Mosul. It will take much longer for Israel to do this in a methodical fashion if they truly are going to clear the Gaza Strip physically and remove Hamas. They'll need to go in, as they already have done, and isolate the bit of Gaza City, the bits that are north of the Wadi that they use as a dividing line for civilians to move across, thin out the civilians, as they've attempted to do, and many would say unsuccessfully, and then clear physically in a 3D environment, neighborhood by neighborhood, moving, it seems, from the overnight reports, from north to south, and clear the buildings, which are above ground, clear the ground level, and of course get into that tunnel system, which has been described as the Gaza Metro, and clear it out, all at time being concerned about the whereabouts of the hostages and their safety. It's an almost intractable problem, but one that Israel will try just the same because of the crimes committed against them on the 7th of October.
NATO Task Force Commander Major General Denis Thompson, thank you very much, sir, for joining us today. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Andrew.